What is up, YouTube Steam blockchain? So today I want to do a video on the topic that humans are basically writing their own unconscious software. That everything a person do from a day-to-day basis is usually tied to their memory and what they've done in the past, what they have registered. Because you can never, for example, you can never think anything original. You can only you can only think from the data that you already gather. So if you're not getting more new sense perceptions, you cannot get any you cannot get any new sort of data and create something original, which is kind of interesting. So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about this unconscious software that humans usually are writing. You can also write conscious software, but if you look at what a human is, they are a piece of software in many ways. You can see it on your own habits that what you did the day before, you're probably going to do the same. And you can sort of see this in other people. You can see their unconscious software, and you can see how they are doing sort of the same stuff. They're watching the same sort of movie. And it's fascinating when you really start to observe memory. Because your eyes, for example, are packed with memory. They remember stuff. And now these machines are going to start to be packed with memory. So they're remembering everything, so we don't have to do all the manual tasks that we either way would have done. So it's very interesting, this topic of that a human is writing their own unconscious software. It's just that humans should be aware about their influences. Like it becomes, I've been thinking about it a very long time, especially on platforms. The idea of following other people, I have been starting to tweak it a lot towards more to people that are building themselves up or they're using proof of brain, because I want that level of influence to come in. So I don't want to follow people that are more, let's say, unaware, or they're not aware of how they're influencing other people, because everyone is sort of influencing. Everyone is everyone is like affecting everyone else. So it's very interesting, especially with centralized platforms, how you're sort of stuck with a lot of silliness, and there's no way you can sort of regulate the silliness. Like you're sort of stuck on it there, and it sort of gets, just because it can win the majority, because it's just as McDonald's can sort of win, because it's like they just slam all this cheese, this salt, sugar, and fat. They they slam it in people's faces, or like they slam it. They know how to like manipulate people and manipulate the masses, and that's how they can be in business. And sure, they are also doing, in a way, they're also, providing cheap food. So, I mean, it's not like a black and white thing, but you can sort of get this idea where that's kind of like how it works also on centralized platforms, where people sort of finding some cheap tricks to sort of manipulate other people, because they sort of learn the tricks. They sort of see, okay, I can't use proof of brain here. I can't use real intelligence. I cannot be myself. I cannot be a human being here. I have to be something. I have to see what other people are doing, and I have to be sort of the same thing, right? So they're seeing what works, and they're sort of trying to follow, manipulate, right, and do the tricks that other people already have done. And they're sort of starting to write their own unconscious software around that, and eventually you sort of start to see the patterns of, well, this is pretty boring. This is pretty boring software that is being written, because it's just the same stuff. I mean, in a way, it can be fine if it's the same stuff if a person is trying to do something new or original, but usually it doesn't really happen that much. So it's interesting. It's interesting how everything you're taking in with your eyes, how everything is being registered, being recorded in your system, and how how you then are like every time you take in something new, you like put it into yourself, and then maybe you reorganize it a little bit. But many people can basically see that it can become extremely repetitive, especially if they're not getting if they're not having great influences of a lot of lots of proof of brain. That basically means that a person really has to stop and think a little bit and use proof of brain and do that level of work. It does take a lot of consciousness. It does take maybe 1 or 2 years where they really have to start to dive deep into things and see uh, how like what they're actually doing. So something that I started to think a lot already a couple of years ago was I was starting to think exactly like how I was spending my time and how I could sort of how I can do stuff more engaging. And you want to get sort of to a point where you are writing less unconscious software and where you are writing a new software for yourself which is more conscious. Because what happens then is there is like people talking a lot about these ideas about habits. But what habits in many ways just means is you have gone unconscious. Like you want to sort of in a way work as a mechanical machine. You want to do stuff. I have to do exactly this thing every day, but that's not really, you don't really have to limit yourself in that way. Because if a person just is conscious, then they see that has each moment is sort of unique and it has its own way of how to relate to it, which doesn't fit into a logical framework. So the idea of doing something every day and like having it as a box, like you're forced to do this every day. If you don't do these habits every day, then you're not going to change. But it's like a human being doesn't have to, they don't have to work as a mechanical machine where they like, because habits basically means you're unconscious, that you try to enforce sort of on yourself. I have to do these things, I have to do these things, where you should probably more come from a space of you don't have to do anything. uh you can just enjoy it. That sounds a bit woo woo, but you kind of guess what I mean. But yeah, so the most important aspect is that people should know that their life is memory and that they are writing their unconscious software. And uh, and uh, try to sort of in many ways maybe like look at yourself from a third perspective as someone would observing yourself. And then you sort of see, like if you're really observing yourself and you really start to consider a little bit what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, you can see that a lot of stuff is very very silly. Especially right now, there's a lot of looking into screens. I do it a lot, but in some ways, I mean, it's like, yeah. But yeah, so we are software. Humans are software. We are just software, used as a computer software in many ways, which is kind of interesting to consider, because in some ways it sounds like super limiting that we are used like a software. But it's like when we are going based on our memory, then we are extremely much just like a software. But humans can sort of, if they just put in a little bit more consciousness, a little bit more awareness, then they can start to write basically a new software. And people should not take these new technologies for granted. Uh, so they should sort of have try to use them the best way possible, and start to write a more conscious software. And eventually then people won't have to they won't have to talk about habits. They won't have to talk about motivation, right? So that is what I want to talk a little bit about in this video. And yeah, people should write a more conscious software. It becomes extremely amusing when you do that. Because in some ways you sort of realize, well, for example, this is a trick that you can try to use. That is, try to do every task, but do it like 5 times slower, and do it for an hour, or maybe 2 hours, and just do every task 5 times slower. It's really interesting when you do that, because you become extremely you become extremely aware then. Like if you do every task like 5 times slower, you don't have to do it forever. But it's like, and when you really are attentive to the thing you're doing it 5 times slower. It's extremely amusing. I've realized that if you do that for around an hour, around 30 or 40 minute mark, you really start to become extremely aware. The first 10 minutes or 20 minutes, you don't really feel it, but you start to sort of realize it around 30 or 40 minutes. I think a lot of people do it. That is like a cool little thing you can try out. It's very interesting, and you can't really understand it by putting it in a logical framework, but you can experience